afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. The Federal Trade Commission reports that it receives more complaints about debt collectors than about any other industry. So our focus today is on your rights regarding debt and debt collection. According to the National Consumer Law Center, nearly all households who are behind on their bills actually paid their bills until they faced a financial catastrophe, such as unemployment, illness, or divorce. In some cases, consumers succumb to the constant barrage of offers and advertisements to borrow or buy on credit. However, federal and state laws require that financially distressed consumers cannot be deceived, lose their privacy, or be treated unfairly. The reality is that many Vermonters do not know their rights, and even consumers who are alert and informed can be confused by the system. So joining me are two attorneys from Vermont Legal Aid. They are both deal with Vermonters in financial difficulty and have tips to share with us. Jean Murray defends debtors in lawsuits by creditors, and Christine Spidell is part of Legal Aid's Low-Income Taxpayer Project. Thanks so much for being with us today. So, Jean, what is it about the system of collecting debts that causes so much confusion?
The debt buyer industry has grown enormously in the last 10 years. Debt buying is where companies buy defaulted debt from original credit card companies at an incredible discount and then try to collect it. When that happens, many consumers don't realize what's happening to them. They might be getting letters or even court documents from a company that they've never heard of. I see it all the time when someone says, I've never done business with that company, and they throw the papers out. Next thing, there's a court judgment and the company wants to garnish their bank account. Most of the debt collection cases filed in court are filed by someone the consumer has never heard of.
So, I mean, all of a sudden you just start getting this paperwork delivered to your home and you have no clue who this company is. They don't have any, I mean, is this, they're trying to contact you saying, now you owe us this debt.
Right. And sometimes they refer to who the original creditor might be, but you've never heard of them and you have no idea why they are claiming that you owe them. So for instance, you had a card with Chase and somebody called Portfolio is saying, I'm calling from Portfolio and I want you to make payment plans with me. So it's sort of hard to take. People quit answering their phones. They do not open the mail.
I've also had clients who've been getting these sorts of calls and letters from multiple companies for the same debt, so they don't know who they're supposed to be dealing with or who they're supposed to be paying.
Are all debt collectors the same?
No. A very important distinction is that if debt is owed to the government, to the Internal Revenue Service or another agency.
Like federally guaranteed student loans is a big one, child support.
So the powers of the government to collect a debt are different than the powers of a private, meaning a big bank or any sort of credit card collection. Those are two different kinds of debts, different remedies, ends up in different places.
And so lots of people are in debt. When should a debtor call a lawyer for help?
Vermont Legal Aid will give legal advice and sometimes representation in a couple of areas. When a low-income person receives papers to go to court from a debt collector, and when a low-income person receives a notice from the IRS that they owe a tax debt.
And so did these actually go to court then, these cases?
Yes, they, and what is actually what's a little bit odd about that is somebody closed their credit card years before, and it's 4 or 5 years later, and they are getting paperwork to go to court. And so when people receive this paperwork, they call Legal Aid, and I help them figure out how to answer the paperwork and answer the court complaint. It's the best idea to pay attention to anything that comes to the court because.
So what kinds of help is there for people who are taken to court by debt collectors?
There are laws that protect low-income people's income called exemptions from collection. What that means is even if the court, after the court process, decides that you owe a debt, if your income is so low that you have to give up the necessities of life to pay it, your income is protected and the court is, by law, not able to make an order that you pay out of protected income.
And so that's, we brought a slide with us, and that's if you get income from the state of Vermont, public benefits, those are programs that you can't get into unless you don't have available income or assets. And
Right.
so the government recognizes that if you're on that program, you don't have extra money to spare. And then there's also protected income from unemployment or Social Security or veterans benefits, workers' compensation. But again, those protections don't apply to the government. Like, for example, the IRS can take Social Security unless you call them and make an arrangement. They do have similar protections. For example, you can get into a hardship status with the IRS, or people know that they can sometimes get their student loans into a deferred status. Those sorts of things, but you actually have to, it's a little bit different with government debts. You have to call the agency and try to get yourself into that status.
And so, Jean, you're suggesting that someone ought to consult with a lawyer even if they think they owe the debt?
Yes, it's very useful. A lot of times we can avoid a judgment being made against a consumer. So when I talk to a person, the first thing I do is figure out what their income is and whether or not they qualify for any of these exemptions for collection. The next thing I do when I'm talking to them and looking at their paperwork is I try to figure out, even if their income isn't exempt from collection, is it possible for the debt collector to actually prove their case in court? One of the reasons debt collectors have a hard time proving their cases in court is they're not the original creditor. They're not reaching into their file cabinet and saying, look, this is what you charged and this is what our interest rate was. As a matter of fact, because they buy the debt, they buy very little information about the debt. That may be enough for them to have the legal right to collect it, but it isn't enough proof in court to show that they are the right person to collect the debt and that this is the amount of debt and there was a contract that was breached. So I analyze the evidence and figure out whether or not they would have a defense if we went in front of a judge for trial.
Is there any time limit on when this debt can be collected?
Right. That part of the debt buying industry is that because they're buying old defaulted debts, and sometimes these are resold over and over, sometimes by the time they decide to take a court action on a debt, what's called the statute of limitations has expired. That means all states have a law that says after a certain amount of years, it's no longer fair to try to enforce a breached contract. In Vermont, that's 6 years. So if it's been 6 years from the last time the debt was paid, the debt collector has no right to go to court to try to collect it. That would be one of the things that I look for. Is it beyond the statute of limitations? Another thing I look for is this particular debt collector, can they prove that they are the ones that have the right to collect the debt? As I say, some of these debts have been resold a number of times, and so they need to establish that they are the one and only person who owns the right to collect the debt at the time they're taking you to court.
Unbelievable. So do you physically go to court with people?
I do. It depends on the case. Oftentimes, we get the case settled before it goes to court. Sometimes people don't call us until after a judgment has been entered, and they need advice about how to deal with the paperwork that comes with trying to enforce a court judgment. So it depends on the case, but yes, for low-income Vermonters, I do enter appearances and go to court and defend against this debt.
And so it's important to point out, too, that it's easier to deal with this before it gets to the court? Better to deal with it before it goes to court? Because once that settlement, I mean, if you get these notices and you ignore them and it goes to court and it's ruled against you, in favor of the collector, do you really have any kind of legal standing?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Your exemptions apply before a court case is filed, at the time a court case is filed, and after a court case is filed. So if you're low income and your income is protected from paying a debt, my advice would be to not pay a debt. And I would say that that's awfully confusing, that letters and calls come in and say, you owe $10,000. If you pay us today, you should pay $7,500. These are not good deals. If your income is exempt from collection, it is not a good deal to make a payment. Making a payment starts the 6-year statute of limitations running over again.
Oh, wow, okay.
If people receive letters and offers and things like that that are confusing to them and they don't understand, I guess my best advice about that would be to consult our website or call the Attorney General's Consumer Assistance Project and talk through with somebody what it is they're facing.
And just so people know, our website was vtlawhelp.org, and the Consumer General's Office Consumer Program is 1-800-649-2424.
Christine, are there any tax consequences if you manage to get some debt canceled or you settle the debt for less than the whole amount?
Yes, and that's another reason why it's usually people should think twice about paying some amount, because what you get canceled, if you get debt canceled, then that is counted as taxable income by the IRS.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I've seen actually more of these cases this year, I think because people have been more successful at getting student loans forgiven, but then they get a tax bill because, oh, $10,000 or $20,000 of debt was canceled, that gets added to your income. Plus, if people don't deal with it, then they get interest and penalties on top of that.
Is there any help for people who owe IRS debt because they got their debt canceled?
Yes, sometimes I can get the debt reduced or canceled. There is an exception to the general rule that it's taxable, but not everybody qualifies for that. So first I would try to look and see if it's actually a valid tax bill. And if it's not, then I would go over someone's options and see what they can do, because there are protections, as we said before, for people.
Now, Jean, is there anything else people should think about when collectors are calling them or taking them to court?
Yes. A lot of people, by the time they get to me, have been very stressed out by repeated phone calls and other kinds of debt collection tactics. There's a federal law, and Vermont has a similar state law that makes illegal certain debt collection tactics. And we have a slide. So this slide is a summary of what debt collectors cannot do. And if I'm going to talk about what they cannot do, but if you find yourself subject to something that you believe the debt collector cannot do, again, call legal aid, call the Attorney General's Consumer Assistance Project. Debt collectors cannot, by letter or phone, threaten to do something they legally cannot do. A debt collector, a private debt collector, cannot have you arrested. You cannot go to jail for owing a debt. They cannot take your property without a court order. So that means if you don't pay, I'm going to come pick up your TV. I guess the exception to that would be if you owe on a car loan.
They can repossess the car.
They can repossess the car. But that's about it. They can't take property without a court order. They can't use language or any kind of tone to you that is harassing, oppressive, or abusive. They aren't allowed to swear at you. They are not allowed to call you repeatedly. They're not allowed to lie or misrepresent about why they're calling. They're not allowed to trick people into paying. They're not allowed to call you at work unless you've specifically given them permission to do that. They cannot call you between 9 p.m. and 8 a.m. the next morning. They can't generally talk about your debt to other people. There are some exceptions to this, but for example, if your sister tells you, hey, this debt collector is calling for you, well, your sister has nothing to do with your debt. And what that actually means is they are disclosing that you have debt to other people.
I want to put up the last slide that we have again for final tips for our viewers and who they can contact if they have questions about this. Vermont Legal Aid, obviously, Vermont Attorney General's Office Consumer Assistance Program, and the FTC Bureau of Consumer Protection. I want to thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.